Okay, tell me what's going on in your world other than being just splashed across the pages of the Power 100 or whatever it's called.
Whatever it's called. Well, I am obsessed with the fact that New York Magazine's media story has been completely overwhelmed or overtaken by their own news that their chief political reporter, Olivia Nuzzi, was the subject of an independent review after it was revealed that she'd been having a digital affair with RFK Jr. And that though she had done nothing wrong, or that they hadn't found any evidence of influence from RFK in her reporting, though I'm not quite sure how you would actually quantify that, she was nevertheless leaving the magazine. And that completely took the oxygen out of their issue.
As you know, I have severe anxiety about talking about female reporters. So I guess we'll get into it because we're bringing in a special guest.
Yes. Well, when we come back, we'll be joined by Harry Lambert, who's been reporting on this for the Daily Beast. And he's got a very interesting take on the whole story.
Okay. We're going to be a threesome.
We are going to be a threesome.
Yeah, in the most innocent possible way.
Maybe it's a digital threesome. So we're now joined by our special Beast correspondent, Harry Lambert. And Harry, you've been working on two stories I'm obsessed by this week, and the media, in fact, is obsessed with. One we'll come back to, which is the New York Magazine Olivia Nuzzi RFK Jr. story. But the other one that I really want to talk to you about too, because you wrote an excellent profile of him, is the fact that Donald Trump is doing an interview with Joe Rogan tomorrow.
Rogan is probably the most popular podcaster in the world at this point. And Trump has done the sort of understudy podcasts. He did the Lex Friedman podcast, did the Theo Von podcast. So now he's doing the sort of granddaddy podcast. This is the guy that invented what someone called wallpaper audio. You know, like those Netflix shows that just play in the background. You don't really need to pay any attention to them. Rogan did the same thing for
Okay,
the podcast.
so I just want to see how many episodes of Joe Rogan's podcast Sam B has actually listened to.
Okay, the total amount of Joe Rogan podcastery that I have listened to is 0 minutes. 0 minutes. I've never in my life listened because I don't care for wallpaper programming of any sort. I don't care for television wallpaper. I don't care for podcast wallpaper.
You do have very good wallpaper in your kitchen.
I don't need extra wallpaper, and I'm not like a weightlifter or really interested in any type of health tips or vaccine misinformation. So I haven't really been an avid listener to this point. Things won't change.
And to me, Joe Rogan just feels like by men, for men, about men, couldn't be less interested. Though I do like men, and I do like to say I did actually give birth to 2 men. So I like them that much, but not enough to listen to Joe Rogan.
Well, that's the thing about him. He worked out what his audience was. He had that from the very beginning. I mean, if you look at the arc of his career, and this surprised me, it might surprise you, he was a key figure in News Radio, the sitcom in the 90s.
Yes.
He basically played a character like Joey from Friends, very good-humoured, thick head of hair, unlike now. And then he's
totally bald now, isn't he?
Totally bald and jacked, as he always was, but increasingly jacked. I mean, he takes testosterone, he takes human growth hormone. He openly discusses this.
Should we be taking human growth hormone? I think we should.
Oh, boy.
I have strong
opinions. What would happen, Joanna? You'd have a six-pack. That's what would happen.
Then I definitely need to be taking it. I need to be taking it right now.
I'm so sorry, but I did see the headline, and just thinking about Joe Rogan as a kingmaker I'm just not sure I'm made for this world. I'm not sure I'm here for this media world anymore. I mean, perhaps I should just...
Walter Cronkite back?
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that maybe I should find myself a comfy bench and just stare out the window for the remainder of my life.
Well, maybe for the remainder of this election. But is this his answer to Kamala doing Call Her Daddy?
Well, there's that, but there's also Kamala briefed that she might go on Rogan. I think the first thing, look, it isn't a podcast for you guys or for many people or even for me, but it's interesting how he managed to create an appeal, right? So what he did is not just produce wallpaper audio, but he gave people at the time this insight into figures who would never have sat down for interviews of 3 hours before and had such an open discussion. You know, he'd give people a drink, he'd give them a joint. He'd have Musk on, Miley Cyrus on, Edward Snowden on to talk about things that, you know, were otherwise being covered in very short form. So he did something pretty innovative. He also, I think, which is the fascinating bit for me, is he kind of created a self-help ideology online for men when the field, I think, had been thought of by men as essentially a feminine form. They didn't need help. And he legitimized the idea that you could speak to young men and say, look, I've got my life together. I'm just a guy working out, trying to be curious about the world. And if you're struggling out there, like, listen to this podcast, be part of the community of people trying to take an interest in the world. So he created, if you like, a safe space. And that's why he is now a kingmaker in an election where...
I'm sorry, I can't. It's so funny to me. Oh, my God. I mean, it's fine. I accept that that's the reality. Just need a sip of my chai.
But it's true that this is the podcast election.
Right. And if it's the podcast election, then it makes sense that Trump would go on his program. But I think nothing's really going to come out of the Trump, Hostage to Fortune podcast with Rogan. The much more interesting interview would have been Kamala versus Rogan, because Rogan's podcast is really, it's so unlike anything Kamala's trained for. Kamala's ready for the jab, jab, jab of a news broadcast interview, list of questions being fired at her, which she can fend off in various ways. She's not really prepared for and has never trained for an interview in which she'll give her nothing but rope. And that's what Rogan does. He just gives you rope, just gives you time to hang yourself. Trump, plays by his own rules. He's measured by his own rules. So people won't really mind if he goes off script. Kamala,
well, there is no script for Trump, right? He's
right.
Never been on script, apart from when he was doing The Apprentice, oddly. Now he's off script. Do you think that there's anything that Rogan can do to have Trump actually hang himself with his own words? Or do you think at this point it's beyond that?
The thing Rogan doesn't like is he doesn't like inconsistency and authenticity. So he wanted to vote for Bernie at one point in 2020, and then he wanted to vote for RFK because he thought they were both consistent people. And so he could try and...
consistently crackpot, yes.
Yeah, right. Well, he could try and skewer Trump on consistency. But I don't see a lot coming out of it. The only thing I might see come out of it is 5,000 men in Pennsylvania who might not otherwise have voted thinking maybe I should vote for Trump.
And he does have millions of listeners, right? I know Sam isn't among them.
I don't even know really what to say about this world.
Well,
I don't. I really don't. I'm just kind of at a loss. I'm kind of like, well, okay. So many people are going to listen to this podcast. It's going to normalize them further. It's going to deepen people's... Either of you think Trump is hilariously funny, or you think he's an addled crazy man, which is what I happen to think. And I find it so worrying. I find it so worrying.
Do you think Kamala will say yes to doing the Rogan podcast?
I'm not sure Rogan's going to invite her on.
I thought he already had. I thought he'd already said that he's up for either of them.
Most of this has come from the Kamala campaign. They've said they're considering going on, but Rogan didn't. Rogan said he didn't actually want to help Trump out in 2022. So this is a shift in focus. I think the one thing I would say about Rogan is Rogan did seem normal in the 90s, and in many ways he is normal in the sense that he's. Trump isn't, but he came up through Fear Factor, through UFC. He was the color commentator for UFC for the last 20 years. It's a normal part of the media ecosystem. It's just not one that maps very well onto democratic politics, which is why Kamala would be such an odd guest on the show. Everyone else that has gone on recently is essentially a figure of the MAGA right.
Oh, God. I'm at a complete loss. I'm just at a loss. I think it's so bad.
You're at a menopausal loss.
I am. I'm probably going to start to sweat any second now. I don't have any insight. I have no follow-ups. I don't have any questions. I just can't believe that we have to think about the Joe Rogan podcast in this way. For fans of it who are fans of it, that's great. It's wonderful. I would never listen to it. I don't relate to it. And it makes me feel sad. Ugh.
I do think your point that it could get 5,000 men in each of the swing states out to vote, and it could have much more influence than perhaps people expected. And just talk a little bit. We were both recently at a talk with Scott Galloway where he talked about this being the podcast election. Sam and I are kingmakers and queenmakers.
Queenmakers, kingmakers, what have you.
Absolutely, we are. So we're all up for the podcast election. But what did he mean by that?
Well, I just think you've got an extremely fragmented media system at this point, right? People are going on shows you've never even heard of. to squeeze out those few thousand votes here or there. And it's familiar in many ways, but this is the first election where all of those trends have coalesced, where you start, every day someone's on a podcast you didn't know about, where it's appealing to some niche, or is it, how do I say it in America?
Niche.
I thought it was different in America.
No, it's niche, but it's click you're thinking of, I think. Clique and click. And then I think...
And foyer.
And foyer.
Yes.
Is it foyer?
Well,
What do we say?
I thought it was niche in America.
They say
here
niche. They say foyer.
They say niche? I thought it was niche.
Here they
Can
say
you just say that
foyer.
one more time? Foyer.
Foyer.
How would Melania say it?
Well, she knows how to say foyer.
But it kind of makes it more interesting, doesn't it, running a campaign? Because you now got to go work out where all these pockets of power are. It's kind of fascinating. You don't just go on ABC News and do a big sit down.
No, well, the media is changing, and we know that because New York Magazine has its media power issue out this week. But oddly, and I like New York Magazine, I used to work there, but oddly it managed to overshadow its own story by announcing that Olivia Nuzzi, its chief political correspondent, would in fact be leaving the magazine, even though an independent investigation by a law firm that they'd called in decided that her digital affair with RFK Jr. hadn't actually impacted her political reporting. I'm not quite sure how they would know that. But despite the fact that the independent report found she was not at fault, she's leaving the magazine, which totally overshadowed their media issue. You have been following this story since the beginning. Give us an update where we are, because this story has really electrified the media, I think it's fair to say. Olivia and her then fiance, Ryan Lizzer, sort of presented as a modern day Nora Ephron and Carl Bernstein. And now they appear to be going through an extraordinary breakup.
Right, they were the sort of Washington golden couple, right? So he had been for 10 years the New Yorker's Washington correspondent. For the past 5, he'd been at Politico co-writing the Town Bible playbook. She had been at New York Magazine as their DC correspondent for about 7 years. And so, they were both independently major figures in their own right. He on the center left, her on the sort of center right, if you like.
And her profiles, you've read her profiles.
I've liked them very much. I think
she's a great writer.
She's a great writer. I'm sad that she's leaving because I'm really going to miss her reporting there. I thought it was excellent.
But the thing about this story is there's their journalistic careers, then there's the catalyst which broke them up, which is the RFK affair. And then there is, to me, the most fascinating question of all that's relatively unexamined, and that is the court filings that they have both now put through DC Superior Court. So they present 2 completely different pictures of this entire affair. Olivia's picture has been quite well reported on and scrutinized. She describes Lizzer as a sort of jealous and abusive ex who blackmailed her or attempted to blackmail her into staying with him when he found out about the RFK affair. That took up all the attention for about 2 weeks. Lizzer offered a brief denial, but he didn't get into any details until last week, where he counterfiled. And he counterfiled and painted a completely different archetype. Instead of the jealous ex, this was an innocent man who's been framed, who's been wronged by his former fiancée. And the big difference between their two filings...
Just so I'm clear, framed for what?
Well, he says he's been framed for having anything to do with, first of all, the leaking of the information. Nuzzi claims that Lizzer was the one who leaked the information into the media. He says that's completely untrue. Framed for threatening her with physical violence, a claim she made in her filing. He says that's completely untrue. He never did so. Framed for stealing her devices and taking material from her phone.
And that's presumably the texts that she was exchanging
with RFK Jr.
Right. Because it was only the claim appears to be that it was only a digital affair, correct?
Right, an electronic affair in some way, FaceTiming, text, whatever that means. I think that the fascinating thing about this is the big difference between the filings is Liz's is full of detail and Nuzzi's is not. Liz's is full of direct quotes and Nuzzi's is not. Liz's is laid out.
Direct quotes from where?
Well, theoretically, we don't know because we're not seeing the actual evidence, but theoretically from text that Olivia had sent him and everything else. And the picture he paints is after he found out about the affair in mid-August, for a month they tried to stay together. And Nuzzi very much wanted to stay with him, which is completely different to what she said. He says that he didn't want to stay with her, and by mid-September, they broke off, and just a few days later the story came out. And then to his great shock and surprise, Nuzzi blamed him in this extraordinary way in this DC court filing. So this is as yet unadjudicated, but I think it's really important to state that you can file anything in a DC Superior Court. You don't have to reach any level of proof to do so. And it's a great way to defame someone, frankly. And Liza may have been defamed, and he certainly thinks he's ready or stood ready to tell the judge why he's been falsely accused.
I mean, she was initially suspended from New York Magazine. He's now been suspended from his job at Politico.
Yes, completely. And it's important to say that Nuzzi says that his claims are wrong. So, you just got two sides warring with each other. But I think the interesting thing, talking to the Nuzzi camp about this, is I'm not sure they're going to offer the point-by-point detail and rebuttal that Liza did. It's almost like, Liza's now in the mud with them, and that's that. But I think it's potentially a very unfortunate situation because there is a truth here. Both filings can't be true. And someone's been deeply wronged here.
Where do we think RFK Jr. is in all of this?
Well, I mean, he's the catalyst for the whole thing. At this point, I feel he's almost out of the story. He broke the two of them up and has managed to fail upwards as he always has.
Well, has he failed upwards? He's failed up to the Donald Trump camp.
Well, I actually think he comes out
fine, right?
I recuse myself from having an opinion on this story. I actually do. I can't have an opinion about it. I just feel like it's a really private catastrophe that's just like playing itself out in such a damaging way, and I hate it so much. I'm going to miss her reporting. It's a really sad and awful story. I think actually the only person who comes out unscathed is RFK Jr., and he's a pig. He's a pig at the center of this story.
I agree with that completely, but should Liza come out of it scathed? Because it's not clear that he has done anything wrong. That's my only fear about it.
I guess for me, I just don't, beyond what happened, and she was just kind of cleared by the independent agency, now it's just a fight between two people in court. So I guess beyond having any kind of sense of whether this impacted anybody's reporting, I've just stopped. I just can't engage with it. And it makes me feel, again, I have two stories that are making me feel so badly about the world because I think that RFK Jr. is a disgusting human being. And I just think the focus should be on him.
Well,
actually.
And the extraordinary thing that he's now hustling, having done the one thing that his wife, Cheryl Hines, his third wife, Cheryl Hines, said she couldn't forgive, which would be to endorse Trump. Not only has he endorsed Trump, he's now hustling to be the head of Health and Human Services, which, given the alienation he's caused in the mainstream medical world with his vaccine theories or anti-vaccine theories, seems absolutely extraordinary. And yet, living in the world that we live in now, it doesn't seem impossible he could end up with that job.
Ugh, it disgusts me. I just have tremendous anxiety about deepening the story about a young female reporter who I've just admired so much. I wish, on her behalf that the story would just die down and that it wasn't playing out in this way. It is. I understand it. It's intriguing. Everybody's talking about it, but I've been on the receiving end of this kind of attention, and I hate it so much, and I hate it for her.
The only thing about that, I completely agree. I think the way she was initially sort of lynch mobbed on Twitter over this whole thing was terrible, and she is a great reporter. But she then chose to go to DC Superior Court and make a series of extraordinary allegations about Liza, which she knew were public.
I know.
So it's like you can't say that.
I know. It's just awful.
So it's. I guess for me, I was amazed how little detail was in the initial filing, and I was surprised how much was in Liza's counterfiling. And the only reason I'm still fascinated by the story is, we've all seen the movie of an innocent man wronged. And I'm now intrigued by whether that's happened here. I'm also obviously willing to believe that, Nuzzi's story is true too, but the big difference is someone has to supply the evidence. And so far it seems like Liza is more willing to supply evidence than Nuzzi.
Well, Nuzzi is apparently heartbroken, and Nora Ephron, all our role models, I would like to say. I don't know if she was yours, but certainly mine.
And my sisters.
Right, and your sister. Well, she took her heartbreak, turned it into heartburn, went to Hollywood and owned her story. So I hope Olivia does that too.
Me too. I'll be there. I'll buy a ticket.